So welcome everyone, and what Dan's going to do is if we do get to 200, he's going to just shout out so we know, because that's the important thing, obviously. Welcome everyone, thanks for coming along to our webinar today on the provisional local government finance settlement that was issued yesterday.
Lie down.
Oops, I think
Lie down.
If you could mute yourself, please.
Lie down. No, I'm going to ignore you.
I think I was being. I'm just going to mute everyone. See you now. I thought I was getting told off. Okay, so today we're just going to look at the settlement in two halves. I'm going to look at more of the technical stuff, what was in there, and try and match that back as far as possible to our MTFP model. And Dan's going to do a really deep dive into more of a distribution analysis and really whether it meets the standard of levelling up. And then obviously the normal format, we'll do those presentations for an hour, and then from 3 o'clock to 3:30, chance for questions and answers and discussions, etc. So the statement itself came out yesterday. I kind of thought it might have been today. I thought they may have gone to the last possible day, but it came out yesterday by written statement. This seems to be the new way they do things. Instead of there being a normal statement to the Commons, it's a written statement, which seems to be the way that things are done now. So they're the documents. Have a look at the statement itself. All the documents you'll need are there, and then the consultation.
I'm not seeing your slides. I don't know. Is that just me or other people?
No, I can't see them either.
Okay, let's
And we're up to 197.
There we are. Is that better, Dan? Yeah.
I think it's coming up. Yeah.
Yeah, great stuff. Okay, I'll keep going. So the headlines from the settlement are really it's effectively the second year of a 2-year settlement. So we've had all these documents that have come out: autumn statement at the end of November, the policy statement at the beginning of this month, then the response to the technical consultation only a couple of days ago. So we knew a lot about what was going to be in the settlement, and it felt a little bit like it was a 2-year settlement. But I think in some ways there were some curveballs that we had to deal with yesterday that we weren't necessarily entirely expecting. It continues a series of real terms increases in core spending power that have gone on from about 2020-21. So in that sense, real terms, the increases are exceeding the rate of inflation. But I think for authorities, it doesn't necessarily feel that way for you putting your budgets together. I know I've been told that quite clearly at previous webinars, and quite rightly so. Your spending pressures are going up more quickly than core spending power in many cases. And I think a thing to really note there is that things are going to get worse from 25-26. As far as we can tell, there will be less money around, and our settlements relative to the rest of the public sector and relative to previous years have been relatively good for the last 4 or 5 years. Core spending power increases are higher in social care authorities as they have been in recent years, but the difference between those authorities and the shire districts and fire authorities is much smaller in 24-25 than it was in 23-24. And we'll explore some of the reasons for that later. I think the real surprise for us, and I know for many authorities too, was with the services grant. That was cut much more heavily than advertised. That fell from 483 million down to 77 million. So we were expecting cuts, and we were expecting probably a lower allocation than was in our model, but 77 million was quite a lot more of a cut than we were expecting. The settlement is much less redistributive or progressive than its recent predecessors, and it's been quite an unsung element of the settlements for the last few years. They have been very progressive, but with council tax now increasing more quickly than grant, and with the 3% funding guarantee for some high tax-based authorities, it does actually it's a lot less redistributive. But that's something Dan will look at in more detail later. So a pre-announced settlement. We've kind of gone through the main announcements that came out. A lot of what we got in today's settlement was announced back in the autumn statement in 2022, particularly the social care grants. There've been one or two additions to that over the last year, but broadly, that we knew about the social care grants from November 22. The consumer price index was announced in September. That's 6.62% using the unrounded. So using the rounded indices. The 6.7% was the headline figure. 6.62 is using the rounded indexes for CPI. The autumn statement 2023. That's when we found about the decision to index the standard multiplier and to freeze the small multiplier. And then in the policy statement in December, 5th of December this year, the decision to continue NHB, to continue 3-year funding guarantee, and we found out precisely what the Band D thresholds were going to be. And then with the technical business rate consultation, the response to that, I know officials wanted to get that out before they issued the NNDR1 last week, so we had a fairly good idea about how they would work. So almost all the numbers in the settlement had either been given to us or we knew what the methodology was. As I've said, services grant was the one we didn't know about, and we didn't quite know how the proxies would be used to split the multipliers within the settlement. There were some other uncertainties, principally around the rural services delivery grant control totals and some of the methodologies around the social care support grant, but both those two things turned out as we would expect them to have been. So there were no surprises there. It's pretty much mostly around services grant where we didn't know, well, we were surprised by what happened. Looking at core spending power, you can see here that the overall numbers, and I think there's just a few things I wanted to pick out. The first one was you can see SFA and compensation for under-indexing the business rate, cap compensation, both of those two going up, and nearly 1.2 million pounds worth of over 1.2 million pounds worth of additional funding through SFA and through cap compensation as a result of effectively increasing the funding within that in line with the consumer price index around 6.6%. But you can see some of it comes through the settlement funding assessment and some of it comes through cap compensation, and we'll explore later exactly how that happens. Council tax going up by 6% or 6.1%, slightly less increase in yield this year than we've had, or next year than we've had in the current year. That's principally because of the increase in the thresholds for Band D are slightly lower for some types of authority this year than they were last. Social care authorities have got the same 5% threshold, but other types of authority, particularly fire authorities and also police as well, are slightly lower. The social care grants we knew about in advance, as I said, so no surprise there. You can see there the funding guarantee has gone up by 133 million to 197 million. Now in our model, we were expecting that to be fairly flat, but with the cuts in the services grant, a lot of the effect of that has gone on to the funding guarantee, and also some of the movements with New Homes Bonus has meant that more authorities have fallen into that 3% funding guarantee threshold. That big cut in services grant we knew about, or we didn't know about, but we know now. The New Homes Bonus, oddly enough, the actual total amount is really similar, 292 to 291 million, but the movements within New Homes Bonus have really been quite significant and quite surprising in places. And then the adjustment for rolled in grants. So you can see there are two adjustments in 22-23 and 23-24. So they're the grants, or the effect of the grants that you had in the current year and last year that will be rolled into SFA in 24-25 or into the adult social care market workforce fund. It's effectively showing you the adjusted base in previous years, and then you'll have had, say, the police pension grant will go into SFA, the workforce grant for social care that goes into the new MSIF grant there. So it's just making sure that it shows you properly what the like-for-like change is. Then looking at the core spending power increase in a bit of context, you can see there 6.5% real terms growth. Not as good as the current year, 23-24, which with all the adjustments is about 10.2%. Not as good as 22-23 either, which is 8.4%. Although I think some of that was as much about the movement between years of council tax expectations following the pandemic. But broadly, you can see there that we've had reasonably good settlements since from 22-21 onwards. But is it real terms growth? There are a few measures for judging this. One is CPI. The latest CPI is 4.7%, and the forecasts are that CPI will be about 3.5% next year. So it's certainly higher than that. It's a good 3% higher than that next year. And so that will give you some real terms growth on that basis. The GDP deflator, which is the more sort of wider measure of what inflation looks like across the whole economy, is even lower, more like 2.3% next year, or 1.7% the year after. So on that basis, you know, the real terms growth is even higher. The problem is, though, for us, planned spending in or actual spending as well in adult social care went up in this year by 12.8%, in children's services by 13.6%. So actual planned spending for the current year has gone up significantly. I wouldn't be surprised if out turns even higher, and I wouldn't be surprised if your budget increases for next year are at least at that level, if not higher again. So some really big actual increases in costs that are way in excess of what the actual core spending power increase is. So you take your view about whether you think it's a real terms increase or not. There's been quite a lot of pressure on the government to find more money for 24-25, but it hasn't really gained any traction yet. I think Michael Gove was promising additional money for authorities in the settlement as recently as last week, but nothing came through. Some reports that, you know, he'd been pressing the Treasury and pressing Number 10 for additional money, and nothing's come through. We wait to see whether local authorities will be able to find any kind of traction and put any pressure on ministers to find more money in time for the final settlement. At the moment, we're not seeing very much, but you never know, something may come through. There's definitely a huge amount of pressure on the sector, and a lot of press coverage around it as well. I'll look a little bit at some of the distribution, then I'll pick it up in a lot more detail. One of the key drivers of what's happening within the settlement is that in 24-25, over half of the increase in core spending power comes from council tax, about 59%, whereas that was only 45% in the current year, in 23-24. So that makes a big difference to how the changes in core spending power are distributed across the sector. And one thing it's resulted in is broadly a flatter distribution of funding of core spending power in 24-25 than in the current year. And you see that in a bit more clarity in the next couple of slides. The increases in SFA, and again, we'll look at that a little bit later on, on our calculations, are fairly consistent at about 6.5% when you take SFA and cap compensation into account. And there you see there's also been no change in NHB, but there have actually been some really large movements at local authority level. And I think Dan will really point out what a big factor that is at individual authority level. And then the 3% funding guarantee has really helped out some high tax-based authorities who otherwise would have dropped even further down. And again, we'll look at that too. But one thing that struck me is that it's a relatively flattish form distribution of funding. If we look back here at our distribution curve for core spending power for 23-24, you see it was very, very demarcated, with on the right the lower increases were very much in the shire districts, on the left the bigger increases very much in those authorities with social care responsibilities, bigger increases in social care funding this year than next. And you'll see for next year you can see shire districts very similar in terms of increases next year, but the increases in relative terms in authorities with social care responsibilities are much more similar. There's much less of an uplift for those types of authorities. Their increases are much similar, or slightly higher, but not that much higher than shire districts. And again, Dan will talk about this in more detail in his section. So now looking at the settlement funding assessment, now this is where I think some of the quite intricacies of the settlement come in. I've been spending some time this morning trying to work through them. We tried to put some of them through the MTFP model that we issued earlier in the month, just to show how some of those changes in that arise as a result of the decoupling of the multiplier, how they would actually flow through our model and how they flow through the settlement here. So in terms of SFA itself, as you remember, there are two elements to that. The first is the baseline funding level, the BFL. In 24-25, every authority's BFL will be uprated using its individual weighted average index, which effectively is saying that there are two multipliers now. One's fully indexed, one's frozen. The small one's frozen. So the amount that the BFL needs to be indexed by has to reflect your share of income, business rate income, from each of those two multipliers. And the government's calculated a weighted average index for each authority. So every authority's BFL is indexed using its own indexation factor, not by a common factor. Revenue support grant, that's linked to the September Consumer Price Index. That's 6.62% increase. Every authority gets the same percentage uplift in RSG. And then, of course, the fire pension grant is rolled into RSG in 24-25 as well. Cap compensation, then the cap compensation element, this relates to the BFL element. We'll talk about that in the next section. But effectively, what that does is that says that that compensates you for any under indexation of the baseline funding level. So if you've got a higher uplift in your BFL because you've got a higher weighted average index, then you'll get a lower amount of cap compensation and vice versa. The two things, and we'll show in a second how the two things do balance one another out. And every authority, as far as we can make out, broadly gets the same percentage increase in SFA and cap compensation when you put them together, of about 6.5% broadly. Just one other point to make as well, that in the settlement papers in the core spending power, the amount of cap compensation that you get in CSP is based on you collecting business rates at baseline. So it's essentially just looking at your BFL and multiplying it by the two cap compensation factors. Looking at an example here, this is for Ada in West Sussex. So as we said, every authority gets its own indexation factor based on its share of rateable values from the small and standard multipliers. So you can see there on that top line, indexation and weighting, CPI for Ada is 6.62%. That's the same factor across the board. But when you weight that CPI for the two multipliers, Ada's actual increase is 1.044, so a 4.4% uplift in indexation. And you can infer from that what the weighting is for the small and standard multipliers. So for Ada, it gets about a third, well, almost exactly a third of its rateable value is on the small, comes from the small business rating multiplier, and about 2/3 comes from the standard business rating multiplier. Then if you look at baseline funding level, as I said, that every authority's BFL is uplifted by its individual indexation factor. So Ada's BFL, it was 1.833 in the current year. It's uplifted by 4.4% to give it 1.9 million next year. And then you can split the BFL into two sections using those weightings of the small and standard multipliers. So you can see you can split the two parts, and those two parts, the 641,000 and the 1.2 million, they're the two elements of BFL, and each of those elements are then subject to their own cap compensation factors. So you can see there for the cap compensation, you can see that the cap compensation for the small business rating multiplier is 24.8%, and for the standard multiplier is 16.6%. To calculate cap compensation, you simply multiply the two splits of BFL against the two cap compensation fractions. Now, I've done that, and the values almost entirely come back to the figures that are in the settlement. They're ever so slightly out, so I'm not quite sure what the reason is for that, but I'm pretty confident that's the methodology that's being used. And I just can't quite make the numbers work yet. We will make them work and put them through the model in the next day or so. If you want to know what your own authority's indexation factor is, you can find that in the revaluation model. It's in the data tab right at the far right-hand side. So you'll be able to do these calculations for your own authority as well. I think that, yeah, the one last point is to remember that the actual cap compensation that you'll get is not what's in the core spending power figures. That the stuff in the core spending power figures is based on your base being at baseline, the BFL. Your actual allocation of cap compensation will be based on your actual amounts of business rate income and on your top up or your tariff, just to make that clear. Is the methodology fair and reasonable? I think it is on balance. Yes, it's really complicated, but I think it does work, and I think broadly I think it's fair. So every authority gets an uplift in baseline funding level that's consistent with its actual increase in business rates income, and that's important because it makes sure that your levy payments and your safety net threshold are adjusted with inflation and adjusted by the inflation factor that's relevant to your own income. So it's adjusted by the factor at which pardon me, your rates are actually increasing by. Although every authority gets a different uplift in baseline funding level, that's offset by the cap compensation payment. And I think on that basis, I think that every authority, regardless of their share of income that comes from the small and standard multipliers, I think the average increase in SFA plus cap compensation is pretty much the same. On the right, we've got two examples. We've got Ada and we've got Westminster, two very different authorities. Ada's indexation factor is 4.4%, but Westminster's is 6.1%, and that's because Westminster gets nearly 92% of its rateable value from the standard multiplier, whereas Ada gets only 2/3. So that means that Ada gets a much smaller uplift in its baseline funding level, only 4.4%, whereas Westminster gets 6.1%. Both get the same uplift in RSG, it's just the consumer price index 6.62%. But Ada's increase in cap compensation is much higher than the increase that Westminster gets. That's because more of its baseline funding level is subject to the small business rating multiplier, which has been frozen. You put those factors together, and the increase overall is broadly the same. So as far as I can see, I'd say that's fair and reasonable. I won't touch too much on the Band E thresholds because we know them pretty well now. Just to say a few things. The first is that the fire authority's additional flexibility of £5 hasn't been reinstated, so that gives fire authorities less ability to increase council tax. It's limited to 2.99%. Separate Band D thresholds have been issued for some authorities who are in financial difficulties, so 8% for Slough and for Thurrock, 10% for Woking. And just to clarify that the DLUC within the core spending power figures has assumed that tax base increases in line with the 5-year average. So going back and looking at your CTR, the tax bases that were in your CTR over the last 5 years, I think that's a reasonable assumption. I think some people have said that their actual increases are quite different in 24-25, and I think that's probably almost certainly going to be the case for some authorities, but this is kind of like an independent objective way of doing it that reflects what's happened in your tax base over the last 5 years. New homes bonus, no change in methodology, but as we said, some big movements at authority level. One question that I've been asked a few times today, and actually something that Stuart mentioned to me yesterday, which I think is a really fair point. I've kind of said that this 24-25 is the final year for new homes bonus, and there won't be any in 25-26. And I suppose that's correct in the sense of the policy ends in 24-25. There is no policy as such for 25-26. The point Stuart made to me was that a newly arrived government might just want to roll over the existing settlement in 25-26. You know, they could be arriving in Whitehall in November 2024 with a settlement due within a few weeks. Are they really going to make any big change to the settlement? Probably not. So that's a good argument, I think, for the fact that the NHB might just roll over for one more year, 25-26. My view might be that an easy option for a new government might be just to end new homes bonus and redistribute it using another grant, some kind of needs-based grant, you know, put it into social care, put it into services grant and distribute it that way. I'm kind of more inclining more to Stuart's point of view at the moment, and I think at the very least I'll update the MTFP model, give you an opportunity to put another year into 25-26 and see what that looks like in terms of the overall funding that you might get in that year. I think 25-26 is much more uncertain in that in a sense than the current year, simply because we don't have a spending review. We don't know what what the future government's views might be, but the time available to them to make any big differences will be very limited. Now let's look at the services grant. This is the one, as I've said a few times, has been the thing that's really was a big surprise, really. So just going through some of the history. In the first year that it was introduced was in 2022-23. It was 822 million. It reduced to 483 million in the current year, and there were a number of deductions from the services grant. So there was 200 million that came out because of the reversed policy on national insurance contributions. There was a transfer to social care support grant of 80 million. There was a transfer to the supporting families grant of 65 million. Actually an additional allocation in the final settlement of 19 million, and then a very small unknown transfer of 12.8 million. Our forecast for 24-25 was 403 million. So just taking the 483 million of the current year and assuming a second year transfer of 80 million into social care. Of course, the actual allocation is 77 million, so a further reduction of 326 million. Now, looking back on the way that this sort of policy, we'll see how this has kind of emerged. So in December 22, the policy statement at that point said that core grants would continue as they are now in 2024-25. Now I took that to mean that broadly services grant would continue unless there were specific decisions to redistribute it around the settlement. Pardon me. In the policy statement earlier this month on the 5th of December, that document said that there will be reductions in services grant, reductions plural. So we had one transfer in place in our modelling, but clearly there were going to be more than that, but we didn't know what they were going to be. Then in the webinar with the local minister on the 7th of December, officials talked about using services grant to uprate other grants within the settlement. That kind of sent alarm bells ringing. So in our email update of the same day, we said that it's likely that the services grant will be lower than 403 million, but how much lower was difficult to predict. So we were acknowledging that there was likely to be a reduction, but we didn't know how much that was going to be. I think it's fairly unfair what's happened, not least in that for two reasons. One is if it's been used within the settlement, it's been used for things that the government promises they would do, like uprate RSG, uprate baseline funding level. They're kind of like core functions of what happens in the settlement. I think the other way it's unfair on the sector is that as recently as the 5th of December or the 7th of December, officials must have known there were some big reductions coming through, and they gave us very oblique references to that this might happen, but without actually giving us any clarity about the scale of the reduction. So I think authorities are, it's fair that they're quite miffed by that, because I think for some authorities that's made a big difference in their budget plans for next year. Social care grants, I won't say much about this. I'll pass on to Dan pretty quickly, actually. One wider point to make is about the NHS contribution to Better Care Fund. It's 5.66% in the current year, and I think it's a 2-year arrangement, but we don't know what that's outside the settlement, and we don't know what that factor will be yet. The funding guarantee, a few very final points on this, because Dan will pick them up in more detail. It's most significant for shire districts in terms of its share of core spending power. So for Wychavon, it's more than 20% of its core spending power. So it's a pretty big deal for lots of shire districts now. But in 24-25, it's got a much wider application outside districts. It only affected 2 upper tier authorities in the current year, Rutland and Wokingham. Much more now, 20 authorities now, upper tier authorities, and a further 13 fire authorities. So it's got a much wider application. Working out what the level of guarantee might be in 25-26 is going to be quite a big deal for these authorities. We've got 0% in our MTFP model, simply because there's just there doesn't seem to be as much funding available in the settlement in 25-26. That may change, but for now we're being quite prudent on that score. Various other issues. I think 2 I will pick up here. One is the surplus from the levy account. I think there's a fairly strong chance we'll get something, but I think it'll only be in the final settlement, and I think it'd be at least as much as we had announced this time last year at the final settlement. Household Support Fund, still unclear, nothing else in the settlement yesterday. Officials said, this is in the webinar on the 7th of December, that no position has been taken either way now, with the minister adding that he would be very interested to hear people's views. I know a lot of authorities it's quite an important part of their budgeting and quite of their service offer. So for it not to be extended would be quite a big deal. But this seems to me that government don't quite know what they're going to do, and I think if they had strong representations, that might be something in its favour. And very finally, we'll be updating the model in the next day or so. I hope to have something out, probably not today, but possibly tomorrow if I can. Some of the calculations around the BFL and cap compensation adjustments are pretty complicated, and I want to make sure that I've got them right, but we'll have something out for you as soon as possible. Okay, Dan, over to you.
Thanks, Adrian, and hi, everybody. So as Adrian said, I want to look a little bit more at how the outcomes from those technical adjustments that Adrian's talked through, and we'll do so with a lens, I suppose, mainly on levelling up, but also on the the financial stress that the sector has got. So if we move on one, and I can't resist this next slide. I like stability as much as Mr. Gove. Are you able to move on, Adrian? And he is the Christmas that keeps on giving. But I guess I've asked this question each of the last couple of years. Last year, everybody was pleasantly surprised. I'm guessing most people will feel to the left-hand side of this graphic that it wasn't as good. It was pretty much as we expected, possibly worse than we expected. If we move on. So I first looked at the written statement that came out itself, because as ever, the written statement comes out and you keep pressing refresh on the .gov website, waiting for the statistics to come out, and they're about half an hour behind. So it gives us a chance to read there. And interestingly, contrasting that with last year, where there was much bigger emphasis on levelling up, they talked a lot about stability. And I guess in that sense, there is a bit more acknowledgement that the local government has pressures, and hence the 3% funding guarantee, and another request to use reserves, which is a little bit of flexibility, but also much more mention of the flexibility around use of capital receipts and the exceptional financial support. And my reading is that there will be a fair few authorities that are looking at some of those sort of exceptional financial supports that they might have an offer, and it comes through loud and clear from the statement. A little bit on social care, only a paragraph, because there was only the 1.3 billion that was effectively announced in last year's autumn statement. Fair bit on council tax, and I'd heard that they might want to do unwind on council tax and let a little bit more freedom. Clearly, that's not the case. So, with the exception, as Adrian's already said, of Thurrock, Slough and Woking, and a few exceptions around GLA, etc., the referendum criteria stay. And for me, and those of you at districts, a lot of you said this, a real missed opportunity there to allow £10 rather than the £5 and 3%. The £5 or 3% is virtually worthless. It was so last year, it's even more so now. But they mentioned for resilience, financial support, and then there's just, a lazy, petty, in my view, sideshow around working weeks that really should have nothing to do with central government, should they? If we move on, a slide, the one thing that isn't mentioned there at all, not even once, is levelling up. And I think that's, as we'll come to see now, is because this settlement, as Adrian's already pointed to, does very little to assist the department with its name of levelling up. And I think not only that, but it starts to show some of the frailties in the system in terms of a system that is becoming increasingly reliant on council tax, with no additional government-funded spending power on the horizon. And if we move on, I'll work through that. So just a very high level, Adrian's already shown this, but I've lumped some of the things together. So I've rolled in the grants to SFA, and as Adrian said, some of them roll into social care. I suppose the additional social care grants, it's the last year of them. They've had a bit of an impact. We've already talked about the missing service grant and where has it gone, but I think that points to the frailty of these transitional grants. I'd count services grant as a bit of a transitional grant alongside lower tier services grant, the funding guarantee, and the fact that they're there just for a while means that it can be swept up and used elsewhere, hopefully within the settlement, but obviously this year possibly not. But if that's gone this year, is it funding guarantee next? As there's a squeeze on the government funded element of spending power. But the main thing for me to take from this, in this draft settlement, there's more council tax than there is government funding, and that has some really, really severe impacts as we go forward, because next year that red box there won't be any extra unless something drastic change and we move to a system where council tax starts to take over again, and council tax gear and council tax dependence becomes a big part of the system. And I think that has fundamental impacts for a number of authorities, good and bad. If we move on one. So this was from last year, I've just put that in, and as Adrian said, last year allowed a lot of distribution. It allowed more social care grants to be distributed to those authorities that served more deprived areas. But this year, much as Adrian's already showed, if we move on one, Adrian, there's a lot less. And along the bottom there, you see the percentage changes in spending power by type of authority. Sorry, I always omit GLA and City of London silly and the fire from my analysis, so it differs slightly from Adrian's. But on an overall 6.5% increase, with the exception of districts, and Outer London that doesn't do very well, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail. There's not a lot of variation. Pretty much everywhere is getting somewhere, usually between 6 and 7%. There are some outliers which we'll cover. But if we go on to the next slide, we should look at it regionally. This is levelling off, isn't it? Because if you look at the percentage increases there, they're pretty much standard across the way. So for a number of years, North East, North West, Yorkshire and Humberside has done quite well, as Adrian said earlier, from the extra money that's gone in. But this is the first year where, if you look at the split between the red and the blue block there in the southeast and southwest east of England, they've got much more heavier reliance on council tax, and as council tax again takes over as the biggest part of the settlement, those authorities are moving ahead, and the government has not been able to this year shovel enough government funding in to do anything other than tread water in terms of creating a levelled off playing field, whereas in the past they've been able to sort of move the dial in favour of the northwest, northeast, Yorkshire and Humberside. So if we move on another slide, and that's now, this is what we could be looking at in the future. So if you take away government funded spending power, you're left with regional disparities in terms of council tax, in that council tax tends to be higher in the south where tax bases are larger, and tax base growth generally is slightly better, but tax base as being larger means that 5% gets you more from a larger tax base than it does from a smaller tax base. So at the point where all we can see in the future is increases in council tax, some sort of fair funding review, and preferably lots more funding has to come in, but the distributional element that council tax distorts at the moment would maybe address with fair funding review, but we don't see that being on the horizon for a couple of years at least. So if we move on another slide, so looking at upper tier now, this is the 1 year change in upper tier, and I just put this is upper tier, so it's colour coded according to type of upper tier, so unitary yellow, Met red, county green, and 2 shades of blue for London. What I think is remarkable here is you've got Wandsworth there on the left that's done really well. Now, Wandsworth just did really well out of New Homes bonus, and it's strange that New Homes bonus, which is only a tiny amount of settlement now, is the thing that seems to be making a difference. Adrian pointed to that. The distribution of New Homes bonus, even though it's the same control total, is one of the reasons why there are differences at upper tier. But it's really striking that 5 outer London boroughs are the 5 worst off, and 7 out of the 8 of the worst off are outer London. So, why is that? So if we have a look at it a little bit. I think the first thing, if you move on a slide, please, Adrian, the first thing to say is that the outer London boroughs, they all did quite well last year from New Homes bonus, and because it's a 1 year bonus, it now falls straight out, and this year they've done much worse. So that's part of the reason. But it would be a mistake. And actually, with upper tier, unlike districts, if you lose new homes bonus, you're probably not going to get much by way of funding guarantee, because the social care grants have already put you towards that 3% minimum. So it means that actually, unlike districts, they can lose a lot of new homes bonus, and funding guarantee picks them straight up. It doesn't happen with the upper tiers. It's a straight loss. Only one of those 5 got funding guarantee, I think Rent did. But new homes bonus is just a little bit around the edges. The real problem for me for those authorities is when we look at their council tax, and 4 of those 5, so I'm just looking at Outer London's north of the Revere, so one of them drops off, the one that's Merton, I think the southern one, but those 4 of those 5 have got really low income from council tax. That generally is because they've got low tax base, but it also might be that they're stranded on a low band D. And anybody with a low tax base or stranded on low band D, when the system reverts to council tax dominance, is really going to struggle unless something comes along by way of fair funding, or there's more funding thrown at those authorities. So for the past few years, that extra funding has gone to those authorities and meant they've not been as badly off as they might have been. But when that funding goes, we're back to council tax, and this massive regressive system, regressive for councils as it is for taxpayers, that those on low tax bases, low tax base growth or low bandees are really going to struggle without intervention. So if we move on one, I think it should take us to the districts. Districts, really strange. Now, you've got a bizarre thing here that almost the same. There's some little differences in there, but Watford, they did really well out of new homes bonus, and I can't help but think, I don't know if there's anyone from Watford here, whether it was maybe even a CTB error in their favour, which would have cancelled out previous years. But Watford have got a 10% increase, and I think the next highest districts are on 6%. It's really strange. But when you look to the end, there's a few of them tailing off. And if we look at East Lindsey, Bolsover and Hyndburn are the 3 districts that have suffered the most this year, only slightly less, but that's because of funding guarantee. But if we go to that next slide, have a look at in a little bit more detail. So yeah, Watford's done really well. It's got an extra 800k from new homes bonus, so just a one-off boost to new homes bonus, and it's a bit of an anomaly, that is. But actually look at the bottom line of this and look at their dependence on council tax. Watford, because it had a big new homes bonus, means it's probably had a big tax base increase, so it'll do well from council tax. But council tax is 66% of Watford's funding. So as council tax goes up and up and up, those with the high dependence on council tax, they'll do relatively better. But if you look at East Lindsey and you look at Bolsover, they've both got about 40% reliance on council tax, and they've had the lowest increases. Now, funding guarantee may pick them up to a degree, but as that disappears and we go over to council tax, they're never going to really, unless they have a massive spree of house building, they're going to fall further and further behind without intervention. And then the third from bottom, Hyndburn, is the one authority that's done the worst out of spending power changes since the formula were frozen. So another authority that has only low council tax, much more reliance on government funded spending power, and with none of that in the horizon, I would say things look pretty bleak for those authorities. And these are authorities, all of these, East Lindsey, Bolsover, Hyndburn, Burnley, they're all authorities that should be being levelled up, if you're to believe government rhetoric on that. So if we move on another slide, so let's have a run through this year's settlement through the lens of levelling up. And if we move on another one, Adrian, let me explain these slides. So it's a little bit like the ones I showed you previously, but this time, instead of ordering them in order of the highest to the lowest, I've taken the IMD score for every authority and ranked them from left to right, from the authority with the highest IMD score, which is Blackpool, followed by Knowsley and Liverpool, right down to the authority with the lowest IMD score, which is Wokingham. So what you see this year is pretty much what you've seen since the social care grants were introduced. And as Adrian's already said, not surprisingly, more funding goes to more deprived areas because social care grants largely need space around an RNF formula for social care. So it's not surprising. Inner London is a bit anomalous. It's got lower IMD scores, but comes high up on the RNF, on the social care needs formula. So it sort of books a trend. But the trend tends to be that if you're more deprived, you've done well out of social care grants. So that's great when social care grants are going up and more's being pumped into them. It's much less great when that's ended. If you move on, probably 2 slides, because this one is just the year change and it exactly follows the distribution pretty much. But this shows council tax. So again, showing the most deprived on the left to the least deprived. This is council tax change per head in pounds per head. And that has the opposite impact. So what you see is the government is having to put social care grants in to make good the differential in council tax increases. You know, everybody gets 5%, but if you've got an area that you've got a high tax base and high tax base growth, your 5% is going to net more than an area where it's much lower. So when you take those together, if we move on a slide, last year there was enough social care funding to negate the council tax increases. So actually the government could have claimed some success in respects of levelling up. It put more, there was more spending power in areas of higher need. But look at it this year, and Adrian's already shown you this, but if you do it against IMD, with the exception of Wandsworth, which had a good year for new homes bonus and quite a big tax base growth, and I expect that'll probably go back to the norm because Wandsworth is not known for hiking its council tax up. It's got the second or first lowest council tax bandee, £400, compared to 2,200 that I pay in Devon. Not that I'm bitter, but you can see pretty much across the thing there, you are it's leveled off, isn't it? There's not really any pattern there that says, I didn't know you could do emojis on. I keep seeing emojis that keep coming up. That's good. I must find those. It's pretty much the same across the board. So it's not really, it's not leveling down yet, not yet, but it is leveling off. Roughly equal changes across the board. And if we just have a look now at next slide, should be the change since 15-16. So we've got to be really careful here, because if you look at the booklets, the spreadsheets that come out, 15-16 is the first year that's used. And if you heard Michael Gove in the select committee last week, he kept referring to the 15-16 base. And I guess, you know, that's as good as any, one might argue, but it is the point at when government decides to put a bit more money into the system around social care. And to take 15-16 as the base is to ignore the first 4 years of Pickles. And the first 4 year of Pickles started with the freezing of the formula. So if you take it from 15-16, you could mount an argument that there's a little bit levelling up there. But actually the formula were frozen in 11-12. So if we go on to the next slide and take 11-12, you see a reverse thing. So yes, since 15-16, authorities that are in more deprived have done slightly better, but from 11-12, those authorities were absolutely created because they had a massive reliance on grant. That grant got cut equally in percentage terms, but you know, much higher reliance on grant meant much higher pound per head cut. So over the period since formulae were frozen, actually it tends to be that those with higher tax bases have done better. And just think, we are now moving to a point where there is no extra government funding as far as we know, and tax base will take over. So this will become, these gaps have the potential to become more exaggerated. So if we move on finally to a view of districts, that's quite a rude signal there, but it has, who's it, Watford, you know, in the middle of on the deprivation. Same thing, most deprived districts in terms of IMD on the left, least deprived on the right. Watford, the anomaly, is in the middle, but you're seeing again no real correlation to levelling up there. So it doesn't matter what sort of level of deprivation you've got about a 4.5 to 5% increase in spending power. But if we look at that over time, which the next slide should do, I mean, this is a real shocker. So in the upper tier, social care grants equalised and more than equalised the impact of tax base and council tax bandee changes over the period. But there is no such equalising grant for districts. Districts just don't have that. You have funding guarantee and they had lower tier services grant before that and bits of services grant. And then they did quite well out of new homes bonus, and they do pretty well out of business rates relief. Actually, I'm talking myself up here. I think districts do all right. But if you look at the distribution since 11-12, you've got Hyndburn on the left there, and you've got Hart in Hampshire on the right. Hyndburn has not managed through its tax base growth to come anywhere near to replace the big cuts Burnley and others got, and most of Lancashire got in it from 11-12 to 15-16. Whereas on the right, high tax base growth has meant that actually cuts that weren't that large anyway, because they never received a lot of funding, have more than been compensated for tax-based growth. And you can have a number of arguments here. I suppose you could say that maybe the Lancashire Authority started off from a very comfortable place in the first place in 11-12, and therefore the need to reduce. And there's, depending on what you think, the arguments are either way. But what we point out here is what's happened since formulae were frozen, before they were frozen, and there's a big redistribution at district level because there's no government funding that's gone in to make good that distribution. So yeah, sorry, Adrian, if you want to go on. So this is, I was a bit lazy. I looked at what I did last year, and I put districts slide up last year, and I looked at it this year and I thought, oh, it's not really changed a great deal, has it? So there are a couple of things that have changed. So previously new homes bonus got reduced, now it's been maintained for another year. Yet again, the £5 is now pretty worthless. There'll be a few authorities that might gain a minuscule amount from going £5 rather than 3%, but it's small, and I've always argued that's a missed opportunity. You could probably take a lot of potentially struggling districts out of that struggle with a £10 increase. It wouldn't even register to the average person, such as the bigger increases at upper tier. There's definitely, it's still stability over fairness. So what's happening is those with funding guarantee last year, what I was able to show last year, we looked at it in more detail, is that the funding guarantee just went to those that got cratered because they lost new homes bonus. So they lost 2 million new homes bonus here on one side. I think you mentioned with Chaven earlier on, Adrian, they were one that lost massive amount of new homes bonus. The government said, there you go, we'll give you funding guarantee to, effectively what you've lost will pay back because you have to have that 3% increase. What it's doing this year, for those authorities who've got massive amount of funding guarantee this year, they're also getting massive amounts this year to keep them above that, because without that, and this is the problem for those authorities, as soon as that stopgap is removed, they could crash. So all of the transitional relief grants, those that benefit from them, I've got to be worried that, as they might, the last bit of government grant left, they might be redistributed to allow levelling up to come in. So that's a worry for them. Those who've never got funding guarantee have never got any of the bonuses that funding guarantee makes up for. So they're not particularly happy. So I generally can't see anybody being particularly happy with this settlement, or if you're a district, many of the settlements, if I'm honest. So the government response is use your reserves. Well, we know now from looking at reserves as closely as we do that there's a massive proportion of authorities, particularly upper tier, but lots of districts as well, that simply can't sustainably use reserves anymore. So I think this takes me to the last slide with 2 minutes to go, which is the verdict. I guess you'll all probably be slightly underwhelmed, but not necessarily as surprised. The disappearance of 300 million services grant, I think, is the one nasty surprise there. And as Adrian said, it might be that the sector's put a bit of pressure to see some of that come back. The additional social care money is a sticking plaster for 1 year before council tax gearing and council tax dominance dependence takes over. And at that point, it's a scary situation if there's no extra money for some authorities, because the council tax system, as hopefully I pointed out, is massively regressive for some authorities with low tax base growth, or low band D. And I think the outlook for them will be very grim unless somebody steps in and either put some sort of fair funding where there's some redistribution. But that's going to be really hard unless a lot of extra money is thrown at it and there's no extra money on the horizon. And with that, I have got one last slide. It's just to wish you all, I've gone for the leveled down Michael Gove face, but wish you all a happy Christmas. And just to promote, we've got I'll put it into the chat at some point. We're going to do a fuller analysis of the settlements around levelling up, particularly in the new year when we've got a bit more chance to kick it about. So feel free to join that and sign up at the link provided. And thank you very much, and Merry Christmas to you all.
Thanks, Dan. Bang on time. That's great. Thanks for that. Yeah, it's brilliant, Dan. I mean, it's a little bit sobering, isn't it? Some of that stuff at times, I think, you know. So, but good to hear. Actually, I was just thinking to start off with Stuart. Are you on the call, Stuart? Hi, Stuart. Hi there. Hi.
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, just interested in your views about some of the, I mean, fairly small controversies, but yeah, in our world, controversies nevertheless.
Okay. What do I think? So I think the starting point for all of this, the predominant fundamental policy objective of this whole exercise is frankly, I think, to get through it with the minimum fuss and controversy. And that's what implies a wish for stability, because stability means that people get what they expected, what they had before in very broad terms. And although there would be many changes that could be made that would allow some authorities to benefit, those would always be at the expense of others losing, and you know, that's not what's required at this stage in the political cycle. Yeah. So low controversy and stability is the driving force. So having said that, I think there are four. The way I would think about the whole package is there are four different aspects to the policy approach. The first is that you take most of the parts of the settlement and conduct a kind of uniform rollover. So you use the same distributions based on the same aged formula and the same aged data, and you just roll those forward, and you replicate the previous funding commitments, such as negative RSG and so forth. Yeah. So that's all very, very much status quo. You take additional funding that you have available, and that, of course, is not from the autumn statement just gone. It's from the previous autumn statement in 2022. You take that funding and you direct it towards the two highest priority services, which is adult social care and children's social care. So that's your second limb. Third of all, you have a council tax package which strikes a balance between the funding pressures overall and the wish to protect local taxpayers. And that's what it lies behind the council tax referendum principles. But the real aim there, of course, is not to create a large backlash that flows back on central government, where the central government gets the blame for large increases. So that's what constrains things there. And then the final thing is the one-off funding guarantee, which is, in numerical terms, it won't feel this way, of course, if you're subject to high inflation, but in numerical terms, relatively high at 3%.
Yeah.
And of course, as the numbers show, we've reached what I think is frankly a fairly ridiculous position of offering a funding guarantee for a source of funds that is a one-off incentive payment, which is New Homes Bonus. It was never intended to be insured through a funding guarantee, or at least, you could argue that way in principle in previous years, but that's where we've reached. And of course, as the figures show, the distributions change dramatically year to year, so it sucks up ever more money, which has to come from somewhere inside the system, and it comes from the services grant. So that's your four kind of limbs. A few other thoughts. The services grant, the way to think about that is it's the pot of money of what's available when all the other things have been paid for. And you can see from the very helpful charts that Adrian and Dan showed, you can see where the money's leaked off to. It's leaked off to uprating the core elements of the system, and it's leaked off to funding the funding guarantee. On New Homes Bonus, I think the main thing, and this is of course the case for every other single aspect of the settlement, there is no commitment to what will happen next year either way. It's completely a blank sheet, and the government is behaving as though either it won't be in power next year, or it wants complete freedom to decide what to do when it is in power, and it may put something in its manifesto, or it may go for more retail policies. On core spending power, the one thing I would say in defence of the government's position is 15/16 represents the point at which we change the definition of core spending power. And we kind of retro work that out as the baseline for the 4-year settlement. So I think I have to put my hand up and claim responsibility for inventing a definition at the time. So that's why some of the comparisons naturally go back to that date, although I think the NAO has succeeded in kind of retro working it out further back to the start of the Conservative or coalition administrations. And finally,
you have to start somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. And finally, there's a question of whether there'll be more money. I think there is a reference somewhere about holding a little bit back from the services grant just in case more is required for unexpected reasons. So, if New Homes Bonus numbers come in and they're a little bit more, you can pay for that there, and then release the rest of the fund in increased services grant. We don't know how much that is. It's not likely to be hugely significant. The only way that extra money is allocated is if there's a massive reaction to the settlement, which suggests that the government might lose the vote in February. And in that case, things go into kind of panic mode. And that's the sort of thing that happened in the start of the 4-year settlement in 16/17. There was a very strong reaction from some parts of the sector. Ministers got worried, and some more money was found. And so in the absence of that and a sense that the vote will be lost, I wouldn't expect significantly more money, at least at this stage. Hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Stuart. Actually, I noted some of the comments from various representative groups. They're using the word disappointed, which I think you said that if they're using the word disappointed, that's fine. They can ministers can deal with disappointed. Anything beyond that is a problem. So that suggests that
They've upped the ante slightly. I think they're severely disappointed now. So on a scale of disappointment, they're at one end. But,
they're right on the edge of tipping over.
It all depends on what people are saying to their MPs and how their MPs react to this, and where the MPs are putting their effort in the early weeks of next year.
And I mean, the one thing that I suppose I'm a bit miffed by with the settlement is the services grant thing, and it's just that sense that here's a policy statement and we'll give you a really good heads up about what we're going to do. And the thing that was hard to forecast, you could tell they were holding something back in the way they were talking about it, and they must have known how much it was going to get cut, and then that was the thing that was they held back.
Yeah, it's an interesting question how long they've known that. It should have been fairly obvious for quite a while, I would think. Certainly since the CPI data came out in the autumn, because that would give you the core settlement uplift.
Yeah.
And of course the absence of any money in the November autumn statement would tell you what your ceiling was and how much money you had available. And you know, as I said, the bucket that remains is the services grant. But you know, they would want to hold that piece of back news back in order to present it as part of a fuller package. You know, if you said services grant's going to be cut from X to Y, people wouldn't see what the funding guarantee would do to them from that piece of information in isolation. So
might work it through. Yeah, and I think as well, just thinking about, we were looking a lot at the precedent of last year where there were bigger increases in SFA and compensation because inflation was higher, but that was fully funded from we don't know from where in the settlement or from where in, you know, DLUHC's kind of coffers. But this year the increases were lower, but this year services grant was rated to pay for it. Last year it wasn't. It's an interest. It was difficult to kind of predict some of that stuff, and I know some councils have been a bit happy about it.
Yeah, well, it's you know, it's a very difficult settlement overall.
Yeah.
Clearly, and it's pulled, like you said earlier, Adrian. It pulled last year. Wokingham and Rutland got tiny elements of services grant, but this year, I think it's about 25 authorities that have been pulled into it. And the problem I've noted for upper tiers, because of the social care grants, generally that gets them close to 3%, which means that other losses like new homes bonus and services grant means they have to bear it. Whereas if a district loses its services grant, it's probably going to get that back through funding guarantee, isn't it? Because it can, you know, it's much closer to the 3% because there's no other new money. So it probably is part of the reason that districts haven't fallen as far behind social care authorities as they were last year, really, given that they've still got the same referendum criteria.
Yeah. Dan's figures on council tax are interesting. The issue there is that the core council tax has not been equalised between authorities since 13-14. There's a little bit of equalisation against the social care precept for upper tier authorities, but for all authorities, the core hasn't been equalised, and that's an important part of the funding reform or the fair funding review. It's not just about needs and data. It's about equalising the tax base, and all authorities suffer from that. It's disguised slightly for upper tier, but they all suffer from that.
Did something happen when Greg Clark came in, Stuart, to do a little bit of equalisation through SFA? Because the cuts seem to no. Oh, right.
No, the thing that was new that year was equalisation against the social care precept.
Right. Okay.
Just a little sliver on the top was equalised through the grant that was available. But since we couldn't touch the core RSG because we weren't having a fair funding review at that time, it wasn't possible to revisit the equalisation of the core council tax.
I think it was, if I'm right, Stuart, it was in 15-16 for those 4 years that you distributed the cuts using an assessment of actual council tax.
Yes.
So it was the cuts that you applied rather than you didn't go back into the base, did you? But you did apply the cuts in a
Yeah, that's right. It was from 16-17 onwards that the change was to, rather than allocating the cuts in proportion to the grant that you received, they were allocated according to a measure of the overall resources. So grant, business rates and council tax. And we actually used actual council tax, which with the benefit of hindsight was there were arguments for using a more notional measure that didn't penalise authorities that had increased their council tax more than other authorities. But it was I think a step forward in using a broader measure than just the grant that was available.
and that's more the accepted currency, isn't it?
Exactly.
I think as well the thing with funding guarantee is it adds another element into some authorities that they're just away from what their real needs are.
Yep.
So some of those authorities, they'll have a lot of funding guarantee, they'll have a lot of negative RSG built up, and other changes as well, that the baseline reset as well. So they're operating at a level over quite a long period of time that's a long way away from where they would be had these things been reset.
Yeah, I mean, that's true more generally. Every one-year settlement that we make takes us further away from the needs-based position that remains government policy. And makes reform more challenging for any government in the future.
Yeah, no, exactly. Jeff, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I've just missed my usual rant, Adrian. That's all.
What is real terms? Discuss.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting listening to you guys talking about what's fair and the reality, but as local authorities, we have to sort this out. As in, we have to sort our budgets out. And let's be honest, austerity was bad. And as you've already, we lost 30% of our workforce in 6 years. That's the reality of what happened. However, who would have thought we'd be in a new normal whereby using your reserves is okay to balance your budget, apparently. If not, you can capitalise, so you're mortgaging tomorrow for today.
Yeah.
And if you want, you can come to us and increase council tax by more than the 5%. Who would ever have thought that would be normal? I mean, it is just the most bizarre situation to be in. Mr. Gove, I'm pretty sure when he was at the CCN conference, I think he thought he was going to get some more money.
Yeah.
There's no way he'd have said presents under the Christmas tree unless he was expecting more money. He's been shafted by either the PM or the Chancellor or both.
Yeah.
In between him saying that and the autumn statement, Gove's been shafted. I've got no doubt about that. But there probably can't be a local authority now who broadly knows how they're going to balance the budget next year. And it's either by savings or using reserves. No one's in any other position than that. The problem is nobody knows what's going to happen in 25/6. So every authority will be planning on the basis of the worst.
Yes.
So every authority is going to be doing the next 12 months is trying to find more savings, even though we have no idea if we're going to need them or not. So what the government has done right now is set councils a challenge, which is don't do what you should be doing in improving services for the public. Just go out there and try and find how you can slash your services. And that is what this settlement's done. It's done no more than that. And the core spending power, sorry, Stuart, is a lot of bollocks. Kind of, it's not real. There's specific grants in there that we have to use for things like delayed discharge. We can't use that to spend on services. Between you and I in Durham, we have no delayed discharges.
Yeah.
None. I've got a £7 million grant that I have to use on delayed, and I don't need, it's absolute madness. Yeah, my tax base, as we've said, Adrian, is going up by 800,000, but the government thinks 3.3 million. So my core spending power is about 5%. Final rant, national living wage 9.7%. So all of our care fees will be driven by that. All of our contract uplifts for next year are based upon CPI and RPI, probably in September when it was 6, 7 or 8%. So our contract inflation next year is 7, 8, 9%, but the government's given us core spending power increase of about 4 or 5. That is the reality for local government. So we have to slash services next year or use reserves. And all of us will be spending the next 6, 9 months doing nothing else other than consulting on cutting services, even though we might not have to.
Yeah.
I think Stuart said something about government policy. I'm not sure there is a policy. We all know what the policy is, which is let's buy ourselves a year and see what happens. But it's going to crush local government. It's austerity was bad, but this is madness, and the new normal of use reserves, capitalisation, and go for higher council tax increases. Let's be honest, is absolutely bizarre. Rant over.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Thank you.
I think I did say that the policy was to get through the next year. But that's as far as it goes.
Yeah. Have we got anyone on the other side who's dead happy with it, who wants to?
Anyone from Westminster on? Anyone from Westminster? Yeah, Watford. I think Westminster got more than they were expecting because of the NHB shift as well. I think they're probably some surprised authorities as well as in a good way and a bad way. I think. Yeah.
And it's bizarre, isn't it? NHB as low as it is now, whatever, 150 million, is the thing now that sort of can make a difference from the average. Whereas, you know, when it was 6 years and there was billions and millions floating around, those were happier times, weren't they? But
yeah,
for Newham's bonus to be the difference between, you know, getting more than average and low is bizarre, given that it's only about 160.
Shows how flat everything else is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That point that Jeff made about that Gove thought he had more money. I mean, I agree that what he said at the CCN conference was a bit odd if he didn't have any kind of like not guarantee, but any kind of like indication that there was more money. He kind of stuck his neck out there when I didn't think he had to. And I think as well last week, I think he thought he had a good chance of getting some more money as well last week, from what I hear. You know, but that was kind of not back at the last moment. And I wonder whether that the genesis of the cut-in services grant is part of that. Maybe they hoped they would have had a bit more cash to put in, and they could have kept that going. But that's what I mean. I don't know. That's what I'd heard about what happened last week, whether that's true or not. But and I guess for us, what does that mean for the next month? Does that mean that there's more fertile ground for local government to put its point across about needing more money? You know, support the Chancellor, support of Secretary of State, maybe. But like you say, Stuart, unless they're really going to start throwing the toys out the pram, it doesn't make much difference. It's not going to work. Yeah.
Adrian, just one last thing for yourselves. We're hearing on the grapevine that the pay request from the TUs for next year is a 3,000 flat rate or 10%.
Blimey. Yeah. That's a lot, isn't it? Yeah.
But I was going to say, I'm not detecting mass anger. So it looks like it's disappointment, which probably means, as Stuart said, the gauges, it'll probably be enough to get it through. I remember years ago being working with the rural authorities, where they did manage to push through what are now, you know, I think sort of 6 or 7-fold increases in RSDG. But that had to be sort of born out of anger and getting a lot of backbench Conservative MPs on side. But I don't detect any big moves at the moment, unless anybody else knows of any. So it feels like everybody will just go through the final settlement just being disappointed, but suffering with it.
Yeah. Graham,
unless Graham's going to tell us differently. Hi,
you
Graham.
want to tell us?
No, I don't tell you anything. Actually, watch this space.
Okay,
we have been talking to the same rural MPs over these last few months, and if we can get them sufficiently angry, and I think we can, what have they actually got to lose if they think that their seats are very at risk? What is there to lose by actually saying to a government, well, hang on, you know, we might vote against the settlement unless you can give us something to argue with our constituents that we have done on their behalf.
Yeah.
And by the way, last year you gave £10 million. Yes, you did an increased RSDG, nowhere near the level of the amount of change which should have come through the 2013-14 settlement figures, which have never actually been introduced. And of that £10 million that you did grant last year for districts, none of it materialised in terms of extra cash because the funding guarantee wiped it all out. Yeah. So all I'd say, Dan, is watch this space.
You need 30 MPs.
We hope to make you eat your words.
Disappointment turns to excitement. I look forward to that.
Well, good luck with that, Graham. Yeah, that'd be good to see that. I think there were a couple of comments, a couple of questions in the chat, Dan. I noticed Jonathan Stockport talking about the extra, well, the 205 million MSIF workforce fund in 24-25. I know we've had conversations over the last few months about, is that something that the authorities should assumes in your 25-26 base. I mean, my view is that I think the fact that it's been rolled into a bigger MSIF pot makes it look a bit more like it'll continue at that level into 25-26. I was a bit wary of it when the profile came out and it was less in year 2 than year 1. But I'd be going for I would probably assume it's in the baseline for 25-26 now. I'll be honest. That'd be my view. Yeah. Peter Maddock. Peter.
Interested in your thoughts about the comment in the letter about our 4-day week, or people doing a 4-day week and using financial leverage, I think was the phrase that was used. I'm assuming they're thinking about some form of legislation around the settlement process. I don't know. Any more thoughts on that?
I think it's quite difficult.
What they mean?
I mean, Peter, Stuart may have a different view, but I think it's pretty difficult to single out an individual authority for, when you've got a formula and a methodology for distributing funding. The bits where I think you're probably more vulnerable are things like membership of a pool, or membership of a pilot, or membership of some kind of Devo kind of thing, where there's a lot more sort of wide-ranging discretion. I think in the settlement itself and grant allocations, my feeling is that's probably a bit tricky. I don't know what you think, Stuart.
Well, the settlement powers are pretty broad. I mean, for example, they don't mention needs. Doesn't say, you have to give out money in relation to needs. So what you have to do is establish a policy basis for giving it out, and then consult on that policy basis, which is what gives you a level of legal security against challenge. I mean, it would be unprecedented to pick on one very specific policy that in practice is only present, as far as we know, in one specific authority, and then construct a whole national policy around it. But as I say, there's nothing in the legislation that on the face of it prevents you doing that. But they'll be doing a careful calculation about what the risks of challenge are in doing that. And it might be quite convenient that this proposal comes out just before an election, and everybody's attention will be in a very different place, whatever happens in time for the next settlement. So it may never happen anyway.
Yeah. Just hold on, Peter. Just hold on. Everyone's rooting for you. Peter, you on mute, Peter?
Because they actually talk about it being part of the consultation, so it'd be interesting to see what others say about central government's interference in local politics and local authorities.
Yeah.
Well, there is a consultation, and there's a document that summarises the response to consultations, so it ought to be in that come February. Yeah,
I wonder whether it'll go into the same pot as putting thresholds on parish precepts. Something we'll do if you don't start behaving, but actually you're never going to do it. You just hope they keep themselves in order. Yeah, hopefully. Jeff, go on.
Yeah. Thanks, Adrian. Apologies to Peter, but I think the 4-day week idea is bonkers. But notwithstanding that, there's no way government can start penalising the council because they're going to afford. That would be a thin end of the wedge in the settlement. So the LGA would have to rail against that massively. That is absolutely bang out of order. If the government tried to then penalise individual councils for any reason through the settlement, it's got to be bloody illegal to do that.
Yeah.
And sorry, if I was you, Peter, I would go through a legal challenge. But yeah, there's no way the settlement can be used in that kind of arena to penalise the council. It's bang out of order.
Yeah.
Thanks.
We're all behind you, Peter. We are all behind you, Peter. Yeah. Just got to hang on for a few more months. Although you never know if there's a new government, they may be as equally irate about it. It can't be worse, though. I don't think.
No.
Yeah.
Thanks.
That's Dan. Anything else that that we've missed on here? I think there's a couple of points that I think have been answered. Thanks to Peter, in particular, answering questions on there. Martin says that the GLA's consultation budget is online now, so have a good look at that. And as Martin says, you know, they feel they've been managing things rather well. Thank you very much. Unlike the way that the Secretary of State seems to take every opportunity to have a good pot shot at the GLA. So good on you, Martin. That's good as well. That's great. I think. Oh, yeah, go on, Martin. Martin, tell us.
Yeah, I think just on that last point, I'm not sure if you're allowed to sue the Secretary of State for libel in the settlement, but anyway, that's another point. For putting out the council tax to deliver extra funding the government asked us to deliver in the first place under our funding settlement, so it's all rather circular. But still, we have obviously as well got the 250 million extra capital funding for TfL, which will obviously help with the new trains going to places like Uxbridge, for example. So that's positive news. Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks, Martin. Thank you very much. Thank you. And I think we just flipped over the 200 barrier today as well, which is the first time we've ever done that. So thanks everyone for coming along. I think, Dan, we'll leave it there, shall we? Is there anything else I've missed?
Yeah. Not for me. Merry Christmas, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, Merry Christmas. We'll get our model out as soon as we can this week, and yeah, catch up with you again in the new year. We'll be around to field emails and questions, but hope you get time to have a good Christmas break. It's great. Happy Christmas.
Cheers, everybody. Happy Christmas.
Cheers. Bye. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.